Jesus' name, amen. Verses 3 and 4 of this chapter, Genesis chapter 24, we read of this servant coming to Abraham. He's not named in Genesis 24, he's actually named in Genesis 15. But chapter 24, verses 3 and 4, we read, I will make thee swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of the earth, that thou shalt not take a wife unto my son of the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell, but thou shalt go unto my country and to my kindred, and take a wife unto my son Isaac. A young bride walked into a bridal shop on one occasion, and she began, as brides do, to look through the dresses. And of course she was picking what particular dress she wanted. And as she was browsing and perusing, as shop assistants do, they came to this bride-to-be and they said, well, have you found what you're looking for? Or do you see anything that you like? And the lady said, not really. I'm looking for a very, very special dress. In fact, I'm looking for the loudest dress that you have. And the lady was wondering, what do you mean? The loudest dress? Do you want it to be bold colours, although it's your wedding day? And she said, no, I want it to be made with the loudest fabric that you have. I want to make lots of noise coming down the aisle. And of course, this was a very strange request, but the assistant just left the lady to it. Eventually, she found the dress that she wanted. She got all sort of sized and fitted up, and she went to pay for the dress. And the shop assistant couldn't help herself but ask, why is it that you want such a loud wedding dress? Why is it you want to be particularly noisy coming down the aisle? And with a very, very serious look on her face and holding back the tears, the bride actually said, because my groom is blind, and I want him to hear me as I'm coming down the aisle. Well, folks, in Genesis chapter 24, we have another man, and he's waiting on his bride-to-be blindly. Now, he himself can see just fine. That's Isaac, of course. But the details of this chapter, his father, he sends out this servant to bring back a lady who is going to be his bride-to-be. He has never met this lady before. He knows nothing about this lady, knows no real details about this lady, and yet this is ultimately what is happening in this chapter. This is, as I've said, the longest of the book of Genesis in terms of chapters. And Abraham, as we read in verse 1, Abraham was old and was well stricken in age. So Abraham's getting on, and his son, the son of promise, Isaac, of course, in him really, he's looking to his son to see that fulfillment, the fulfillment of the promise of a people be further developed and further fulfilled. But as of yet, Isaac is not married. Now, in Bible times, you were usually married by the age of 30. Isaac is approaching 40 here. And so Abraham, he is praying about this matter, desiring to see Isaac settle down with a family and with a home. And so Abraham decides to take out a bride for his son Isaac. And he does something that I think is good practice. He looks around and he recognizes that the women in Canaan, remember, they are in Canaan now, they have reached the land of promise. The women in Canaan are worldly women. They are not godly individuals. Remember, Canaan was a pagan place whenever Abraham arrived there. And so Abraham felt that it would be better for his son to take a bride from his homeland, from the Ur of the Chaldees, from Mesopotamia. And so we read in this chapter that he comes to his servant. He's not mentioned in chapter 24. As I've said, it's probably Eliezer, the steward or the slave mentioned in chapter 15. And he gives him this charge to go back to the ladies of Mesopotamia, go to the area and find a wife for his son Isaac. And as we have read, we read providentially that he ends up going back to Abraham's brother's house, Nahor. And there you read all the events that we have read of, events that I'm sure that you're aware of, where eventually the question is asked that we read, wilt thou go with this man? That's the question put to Rebekah. Verses 56, 57, 58. Will you go with this man? Are you going to come back and be part of his bride? And we find then through the rest of the chapter, didn't read it for sake of time, but in the rest of the chapter, Rebekah is persuaded by this servant. That's the detail here that I want us to focus in on. She's persuaded by this servant to come back and to be the bride of the father's son, to be the bride of the son of promise, to be the bride of Isaac. And so here we see this servant sent to win a bride for Isaac, bringing her back then into union with Abraham's son. And I trust you see the picture here. It's not a forced picture. I believe it's there given by God. What are you and I, folks? We are servants of the Lord. What does God command you and I to do? Well, He sends you and I out into this world to seek out what? To seek out a spiritual bride for the Son. To seek out individuals who are not yet married to Jesus Christ, the great bridegroom, and to convince them and to set before them the glories, the splendor, the riches of Jesus Christ, and to see them, ultimately them, be part of the bride of Jesus Christ. In Revelation chapter 19, verses 7 through 9, there's the picture of what is going to happen, or what will the return of Christ look like. And it'll look like various things, but it's described there as a marriage supper, where the bride, the church of Christ, will be consummated in terms of her relationship to her bridegroom. And then the very last chapter of Revelation, after setting before us what it's going to look like when Jesus returns to gather in His people finally, in Revelation 22 there's this great invitation in verse 17. Well, we read, now listen to the detail. The Spirit and the bride say, come. And him that heareth say, come. And let him that is athirst come. Do you notice who calls people to Jesus Christ? The Spirit calls people to Jesus Christ. But how does the Spirit work? It's not the Spirit alone. The Spirit works through the bride. The Spirit and the bride say, come. And what you find there is, yes, the Spirit of God calls people to be part of the marriage supper of the Lamb, but He uses the bride. He uses you and I. He uses the church. And it's through the Spirit of God empowering the church of Jesus Christ will people ultimately then be part of the marriage supper of the Lamb. Will people be saved? And so here we find in Genesis 24 an embryonic, a kind of a picture here of what you will find in the great, and what's going on today and then in the great day. That's what you and I are here to do, folks. As the servants of the Lord, as the bride of Jesus Christ, we're to bring others with us to be part of the bride by the help of the Spirit. So let's come today and think about the subject of seeking a bride for the Son and learn some lessons from this servant Eliezer. Want you to think with me firstly about the servant's position. His position. We read of this servant's position in verse 2. We read that he said to his eldest servant, important detail, of his house, that here's another detail, ruled over all that he had. Put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh. As I said in chapter 15, Abraham's servant is named as Eliezer. But in chapter 15, it's interesting because he's described as a steward. He's described there as really a slave, one of many slaves or servants in Abraham's household. You must remember that Abraham had a household, a large household, a large way of going, we could say, in our language today. And so in chapter 15, Eliezer is one of many servants or slaves. But time has passed, as we have understood. Now, of course, Isaac is growing up. He's getting on. He needs a bride. But I want you to see, as time has progressed, so has Eliezer's position in Abraham's household. Look at it again, verse 2. He said to his eldest servant that ruled over all that he had. So I want you to see this, that Eliezer, with the passage of time, with the passage of decades, he has proved himself. Before he was just a steward, before he was just one of many slaves, but now what he really is what you see later in the book of Genesis. Remember what happened to Joseph? He was made over all of the house of Potiphar. That's what you find here with Eliezer. because he was faithful, because Eliezer had proved himself to be faithful, to be true, to be loyal, to be trustworthy. Now he's not just a slave, he's the eldest servant, and that's not just eldest in terms of age, but really there's the thought there of rank as well. It goes on to explain that ruled over all that he had. And so here he is, he's developing here, he's progressing within the confined realms of this household. And yet amazingly, even though he's been serving Abraham for decades at this stage, if you read this chapter and you count 19 times, folks, 19 times he calls Abraham his master. So even though he's been promoted in this household, there's always with that mind that I'm ultimately his servant, his slave. He is my master. He is over this household. But yet he has proved himself. He has proved himself. But there's something very interesting goes on here in verse 2, isn't there? Abraham says to Eliezer, "Put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh." Now, what you have here is a very, very common practice in Bible times. There's no impropriety here. And what you have here is him making a vow. Eliezer, that is. He's making a vow to Abraham. "Put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh." It was a special ceremony. It was used by inferiors who were swearing to superiors that they were going to be obedient, that they were going to be faithful in this particular thing or task that they've been asked to do. So it's nearly like them entering into a covenant, entering into an agreement. And this is important, folks, because he's been his servant for many years, for many decades already, and yet this errand was special. This errand was a particular errand solely for Eliezer the servant. He has proved himself over decades, and so what Abraham is really asking Eliezer to do is, for this special assignment, for this task, it requires your unreserved loyalty. It requires that you persist and you continue until the work is done, until you come home with a wife for my son Isaac. He's teasing out of him, even though he's already experienced decades of faithful service from this servant. He's teasing out of him again a recommitment, a rededication. Here is Eliezer swearing, making a vow, promising to be faithful to Abraham, his master, his superior. Because this was an extremely important task. A very important task. You could say this, folks, that the history of, or the continuation of the nation of Israel and the fulfillment of all the promises given to Abraham rested on this task. If there's no wife for Isaac, then there's no posterity after Isaac. There's no seed of Abraham and seed of Isaac and seed of Jacob, etc., etc. There's no people of God. And so this is extremely important. And he comes I really want you to get this, folks. I'm emphasizing this. That he comes to someone who's been in the service of God, who's been in his business, over his household for decades, and he asks him specifically to reconsecrate, to rededicate, to revow himself and reavouch himself to this master. And folks, there's a lesson here for all of us, that before there can be success in seeking for Christ, there must be a resubmission to him. But I think especially for those who have been like Eliezer's steward, you've been saved a long time. And yes, I'm sure 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, you pledged allegiance to your master. But God is saying to you today that he requires a rededication, a redoubling, a fresh submission of your efforts to him. Now, why does he require this of you at this particular time? Well, you see the pattern here, don't you? The posterity of the people of God depends upon it. The bringing in of the bride of Christ, folks, depends upon it. Let me be very clear here, folks. There's no wife for Isaac. There's no children for Isaac. There's no nation of Israel. If there is no salvation blessing that comes to the church of Christ, there is no church of Christ, humanly speaking, in the decades to come. The church of Christ, if it doesn't evangelize, will just fossilize, as Spurgeon said. If there is not a wave of people coming to Christ, what will happen? The church will, well, humanly speaking, cease to exist. Of course, there'll always be the church of Christ here on earth until he returns, but it may not exist in this country. And so God is calling you, not to make a vow per se, but he's certainly calling you to rededicate and resubmit your life to him. Why? Because the future of this land, the future of our denomination, the future of this congregation depends on it. Who is going to change this congregation in terms of see people won to Christ? It's the bride of Christ here. It's the people of God here. My friend, it's you. It's not the business of somebody else. It's the business of you. And God is sending you forth, my friend, today, like he is Eliezer, his servant, to seek out a bride for his son. And yet that's going to require you to rededicate and resubmit your life to him. And to say, Lord, here I am. Come and use me. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, we'll look at this probably in a number of months' time as we get to the book of Deuteronomy and the study of Moses. But Moses there, he rebukes the majority of the children of Israel for their disobedience in the wilderness. And yet he goes on to just at the start of the book, in Deuteronomy 1:36, he mentions out a few who were obedient. He singles them out as an example. Deuteronomy 1:36, see of Caleb the son of Jephunneh. He shall see it, and to him will I give the land he hath trodden upon, and to his children, because he hath wholly followed the Lord. Why was it that Caleb inherited the land and Joshua as well? Well, ultimately because they wholly followed the Lord. And that's a solemn thing, my friend. When you think of the millions that wandered through the wilderness and yet perished in the wilderness and never inherited the land. Moses is warning. He's encouraging. He's imploring these people. No, even now as we're on the brink of the promised land, look at the faithful example of individuals who were wholly consecrated to God. A wee boy was asked by a teacher to do a special errand, and he says, Miss, I ain't going nowhere. Now, this lady was very, very particular in her English, and that's not a bad thing. And she said, now, Johnny, that's bad English. It's, I am not going anywhere. You are not going anywhere. He, she, or it is not going anywhere. And he said, well, miss, by the sounds of things at this rate, it looks like nobody ain't going nowhere. And folks, the Church of Christ is not to be like that. We're to go somewhere. We are to do something. We are to rededicate and re-give our lives to Jesus Christ. The servant's position. Think with me also about the servant's preparation here. Verse 10, the servant took 10 camels. Of the camels of his master departed. But notice this, for all the goods of his master were in his hand, and he rose, went to Mesopotamia, the city of Nahor. This servant Abraham that was called by his master, or Eliezer was called by his master Abraham, he was called to do a great task. A massive task, a huge, a vitally important task for the historicity of the people of God, as I have said. This was a massive task. And so he was to be prepared. That's why God chooses Eliezer as one of his choicest servants, because he knows that this task needs careful and methodical thought. It needs prayer. It needs submission. It's going to need persistency in the face of opposition in all of these journeyings. And so he chooses this man because he knows that he can trust him. And he shows here in this verse why exactly Abraham trusted him. Because if he had got perhaps a younger servant, maybe someone who was not as experienced, who hadn't prepared themselves or hadn't proved themselves, in Abraham's household, then perhaps a younger servant would have just been excited at this prospect. He might have just hopped on a camel or some form of animal and headed straight to Mesopotamia. But I want you to see that this servant is careful. He's thoughtful in his preparation. He gets 10 camels in verse 10 here. But notice it says, for all the goods of his master were in his hand. So, in other words, everything that Abraham had, it was at the disposal of Eliezer. When you read through the rest of this chapter, you find that there are other things then that he takes. Verse verse 30 speaks of the earrings, the bracelets upon his sister's hands. And then on down the chapter, where is it there? Verses 35. Bless my master greatly, become great. And he hath given him flocks, herds, silver and gold, maidservants, manservants, camels and asses. You go on in then to verses 50 odd, and you read that he even gives the in-laws. He gives the brother-in-law of Rebekah and other relatives. He gives them silver and gold and clothing. The point is this, my friend. He prepared himself with all of the possessions of the son to set before this bride. To show this bride just the wealth of the son. The wealth of Isaac. All that he stood to inherit from his father. All of these camels, all of these lands, the riches, the silver, the gold. He was really saying to Rebekah that this master of mine, he is a rich man, and all of this will be yours, Rebekah. Will you then come and go with this man? And folks, this is how you ultimately win people to Jesus Christ. What is your task? Your task is very simply not to, obviously, entice people with gold and silver. Your task is to present the riches of Christ to fallen men and women. Because that will be the only thing that will attract people to Jesus Christ. Is to set before them the wealth, the bounty, the beauty, the loveliness of Jesus Christ. And so to set before fallen men that you obviously want to be part of the bride, if you want to win this bride, then you're going to need to know about the riches. You're going to need to know how to set the riches before men and women. And so I ask you, having possessed these riches yourself, the riches of Jesus Christ, do you know how then to present these riches to individuals? You think of the book of Ephesians, as Paul wrote to the church at Ephesus. Especially chapter 3, but also in chapter 2 he mentions it, but especially chapter 3, he majors on the riches of Christ. And in chapter 3, verse 18, what does he pray for the saints there? That they may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth, the length, the depth, and the height. He was praying that they would know, have a greater understanding of the breadth, of the width, of the height, of the depth, of the riches of Jesus Christ. Romans chapter 11, a very interesting chapter of the Bible, and a very difficult chapter for some to understand. What you really have in Romans chapter 11 is God's sovereignty in election. In a nutshell. There's many other details about it, but in a nutshell. And Romans chapter 11, verse 33, it speaks there of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God. You see how it's described there? Comprehending in some way the purposes of God in electing his people. It's described as the riches of knowing God. The riches of understanding him. The riches of Christ. And so I ask you today, before you go, are you gathering? Are you gathering up the precious gold, as it were, so that you might be able to set before men and women, boys and girls, fallen individuals, that you want ultimately to go with you to the great marriage supper? Are you gathering up gems for the treasure chest, that you might be able to set them before individuals? You know, we're told in church history that whenever John Huss, of course the great reformer there in the Czech Republic, before he was arrested and informed that he was be burned to death for his faith, do you know what he did to prepare himself to be burned? He got a fire, and he would hold his hand over the fire to prepare his hand for being burned at the stake. Preparation. That's some preparation. Now, God may never ask you to do that and to go to those lengths of preparing yourself for service for Jesus Christ. And yet, to see the lesson there, folks, we are to be prepared. We are to have the loins of our mind girded up with the truth, that we might set before men and women all the beauties and the treasures and the glories of Christ. His servant, he had this position, but his preparation. We'll think thirdly here about the servant's promise. Verse 7, the Lord God of heaven, which took me from my father's house, from the land of my kindred, which spake unto me, that sware unto me, saying, unto thy seed will I give this land. He shall send his angel before thee, and thou shalt take, and notice it, how definite it is, thou shalt take a wife unto my son from thence. So we've seen already in verse 2 that Eliezer makes this promise to Abraham, this vow, this covenant, to be faithful to Abraham, to try and seek out a bride for Isaac. And the dialogue continues, and Abraham then responds to Eliezer by reminding Eliezer of the promise that God had given to him way back in Genesis chapter 12. What did God say to him when he called him from Mesopotamia to the land of promise, to the land of Canaan? He told him that he would enjoy a people, but also enjoy a place. Unto thy seed, verse 7, those two things are encapsulated. To thy seed, your children, your people, Abraham, will I give this land. And remember where Abraham's standing. And remember who he's seeking a bride for. Abraham's standing now in the land of promise. And he's seeking a bride for his posterity, seeking a bride for his son. Genesis 12, he was promised Canaan and he was promised children. Here we find Genesis 24, he's standing in Canaan and he wants a bride for his child. God has fulfilled this promise. And now in the same light, in the same vein, he's saying, verse 7, the Lord that has given me the promise of Genesis 12, he's saying in verse 7, the Lord's fulfilled this. In a nutshell, he's saying, here I am, I'm in Canaan. And I'm seeking a wife for my children. Unto thy seed will I give this land. And so that's why he's saying very definitely, verse 7, as God has done so to me. Again, notice how definite it is, verse 7. Thou shalt take a wife unto my son from thence. You're going to go to Mesopotamia, and you will take a wife from there. Now, if you look in the intervening verses, you'll see that, well, Eliezer, he doubts this a little bit. That's what really happens from verses 3 to 6. He's kind of full of doubt, and what will happen if she doesn't go with me? He's asked this question, and you know what happens here? Notice it again here. It speaks here of verse 7, he shall send his angel before thee, and thou shalt take a wife unto my son from thence. He's saying there'll be one who will go before you. And he goes on to actually say in verse 8, if the woman will not be willing to follow you, then you're clear from this oath and this covenant. Only bring not my son thither again. In other words, if there's a woman there, you feel she's the right one, and they're just unyielding and unwilling, then you are clear from this oath. But do not take Isaac with you back there. He's to remain in the land of promise. So this is how certain. I want you to see this. Abraham is absolutely certain because he's standing already. You could say he's standing on the promises, quite literally. He's standing in the land of promise. And so he is convinced that this is the will of God. He is convinced that it is God's will that there will be a posterity for his son. And so he says, verse 7, thou shalt take a wife unto my son from thence. What encouragement there is for us today here in the Church of Jesus Christ, in these days where, if we're honest, we're a wee bit like Eliezer. Will God really bring in a bride for his son? And you're full of all of these doubts, and you look at, in many ways, you look at what Abraham looked at, you look at the paganism of what is around you, and you wonder, will there really be a bride that will come out of this? Absolutely. Oh, God is saying, yes, there will be a bride bought by the precious blood of Jesus Christ that will one day be with me, the great bridegroom. You think of John chapter 6 and verse 37, that wonderful encouragement when people are coming to Christ. Him that cometh to me, I'll in no wise cast out. That's what Christ says. People come to me, I'll not cast them out. Now, why does he say that? He says that on the grounds of the first half of the verse. John 6 verse 37, all that the Father giveth to me shall come to me, and him that comes to me I will in no wise cast out. What is Jesus saying? He's saying there was a people given to me by the Father in eternity past. And because they have been given to me, and I have died for them, will die for them on the cross, they shall come to me. They will definitely come to me. Not one of them will be lost. And as they will definitely come to me, as they come to me, John 6:37, him that comes to me, because they've been given to me by the Father in the covenant, they've been given to me by God. Because they come to me, I'll not cast them away, I'll not cast them out. Not one of them will be lost in that great day. Be encouraged. Be encouraged to press on, because God has planned that there is a people, and he has planned that Jesus has already died for those people, but he has also planned that the bride should go and bring in and see this people won unto Jesus Christ. William Wilberforce, of course, he battled greatly against the issue of slavery, and he said this: our motto must continue to be perseverance. And ultimately, I trust the Almighty, listen to it, will crown our efforts with success. And he lived to see it fulfilled, didn't he? And in a much more spiritual sense, our motto as a Church of Jesus Christ should be perseverance. Why? Because we trust, based on what God has said in his word, that our Master will crown our efforts with success. There will be a bride, one, for the Master. Now, one last thing. We could say much more. We could say how he promised to be with them. We could see various different things. But notice here one last thing quickly. The servant's path. His position, his preparation, his promise. Look at his path. Verse 27. Eliezer said, blessed be the Lord God of my master Abraham, who hath not left destitute my master of his mercy and truth. I being in the way, the Lord led me to the house of my master's brethren. He went on this journey, obviously, from Canaan to the Ur of the Chaldees to Mesopotamia. And providentially, he goes to the river. He goes to try and get water for his camels. We know the story of how Rebekah, how she was the one who bent down and had the head up. And then obviously she fed the camels as well with water, gave them to drink. But you see how Eliezer puts all of this together? I being in the way, the Lord led me to the house, to the place of my master's brethren. All of the details here, and of course there are a lot of details here, we haven't time to go over them, but all of the details here show that God was in this whole thing, that God led him to the place, the very place of Abraham's brother, Nahor. He led him to the very person in the place, Rebekah. Now remember, he had done his job. He had prepared himself. He had been armed with the promise, and undoubtedly he had persisted in this treacherous journey. And so he sums it all up as he makes his way back ultimately. He sums it all up by saying this, that the Lord was in this all. I was led to the right person, the right place, the right time, the right period. It all was brought together. What was the result? Isaac had a wife. He had a wife that, yes, he had never met before, but he had a wife. He had a wife. And when you're in the way, the Lord will prepare the way, and he will also show you the way. The Lord does this. This is how providence works, folks. He's over all of the minute details of your life, the place of employment, the place where you go, and he brings you to the right person at the right place at just the right time. And as you set before them the riches of Christ, just as Isaac did, as he sought to woo this woman, as he sought to have her, and he set before her the riches, it's the same as you set before them the riches of Christ. And what happens? They come and be part of the bride. This is what happened with Philip, wasn't it? In the midst of revival, God told him to go to Samaria. What happened? Just at the right time, the right person who was reading the book of Isaiah in Acts chapter 8, verse 29, the Spirit said to Philip, go near, join yourself to this chariot. He obeyed the Lord, yes, but God then brought the right person just at the right time his way. And so we trust in the sovereign God today. We trust in the God of providence. The Lord not merely devises our steps, he directs them. He leads and guides you to those whom Jesus has died for, those who will respond. I trust we'll all be about this business of seeking a bride for the Son. May God bless these few thoughts to your hearts and lives today. I want to close our service by